Hello and welcome to the lecture on World War II and the home front. Now, World War II is going to be a revolutionary event for the United States. It's going to be a completely different country by the time they get to the end of it. And it's very similar to, say, the Civil War. The Civil War was a revolutionary event for the United States as well. You know, before and after the industrial capacity in both of these wars will greatly expand. And it's going to make the United States the outright world leaders. Now, they'll be challenged for that global leadership, but the United States is very much standing tall. Global leaders, political leaders, military leaders after the war, and they're going to completely break off that isolationist shell and emerge as a superpower after the war. So this is the first of the AP concept outlines, and we'll look at some of the other ones that to go along with this. Now, first off, the shock of war. And World War I, the United States entered with really weak rationalization. And because of this, millions did not support the war and spoke out against it. So you had to have coercive actions like the Alien and Sedition Act to suppress speech against the war, and a lot of government propaganda to sort of, build up a drumbeat of support. Now, World War II, they were shocked into the war with the Japanese sneak attack at Pearl Harbor, and this created broad, unanimous support for the war. Pretty much everybody was for the war in the United States. And this included, the Italian Americans, German Americans. They were very much loyal, and, most of them had been born in the United States, which would be very different for, say, their parents or their grandparents, who in World War I might not have been as loyal as they were. And those Americans who were being supporters of Hitler just disappeared. All right, so the second of the key concepts here is that the Americans viewed this as a good fight, that is good versus evil, and it's the side of America is on the side of good against the evil of Germany and Japan. And this will be very much reinforced after the war once it becomes clear to the extent of the brutality and the barbarity and the evilness of what they did during the war, particularly the Holocaust. But the Japanese were quite cruel in their treatment of the Chinese and others in Southeast Asia, and were conducting a number of experiments on humans, much like the Holocaust did as well. And here's some unfortunate survivor, well, fortunate to survive, but had gone through just hell, victims of the Holocaust. And so the propaganda is very much of evil versus good. And this is a famous Norman Rockwell painting where he'd taken a speech by FDR, the Four Freedom speech, and put it into a painting. What is America fighting for? Ours to fight. For freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear. All right, to the third of the key concepts, the productivity during the war, the mass mobilization of American society. This ended the Great Depression, and the industrial base played a pivotal role in winning the war. And did they ever build? They built on a massive, massive scale and puts any other sort of spurts of production to shame. And first half of the United States entering the war in 1942, $100 billion in contracts to companies to build and build and build. And this is more than the entire nation's GNP of 1940, just to put it into perspective. And what did they build? Well, 6,500 naval vessels, 300,000 planes, 86,000 tanks, 64,000 landing craft. Those are taking soldiers from boats onto the beach. 3.5 million jeeps, 12 million rifles and machine guns, 47 million tons of artillery shells, and all those other things that you gotta build. And they built, not just for them, for the British, the Soviets, the Chinese communists, the Kuomintang as well were beneficiaries of this building. And how are they going to do it? Well, they got to set up a command economy now. Command economy really doesn't work very well in peacetime, but during wartime, when you've got one big customer, the government, it's much easier to manage. And so they create a war productions board to oversee who's going to get key resources and to sort of help facilitate the whole thing, and to control the rationing and conservations of key things, particularly rubber. Rubber was in very short supply for civilians, and you got a flat tire in your car, well, TS, you're not going to be able to get a new tire. And speed limits is also a way to curb down in rubber use. And prices. With all this money being injected into the economies, you're going to have so much more money chasing fewer and fewer products. So there's a grave concern of inflation. And so they put in price controls and rationing. And for labor, wage limits on wage increases and no strikes. If there's any threat to a strike of a key industry, the government's just going to come in and take over. And manpower, woman power. 15 million men, number of women enlisted into the military. 20% of the male population was in uniform, so a dire need for labor. Who's going to take over? Well, Mexican Americans was one source, and what was called the Bracero program, and to bring up Mexican Americans to work mostly in agriculture. And 6 million women entering into the workforce, many daycare set up for them. The majority of women don't enter the workforce, so don't get that impression that all women were sort of all of a sudden working now. And the percentage is much smaller than in Britain or the Soviet Union. And most will leave voluntarily after the war. Famous Rosie the Riveter. And there's some of our riveters right there. And we get a roaring economy going. Unemployment becomes non-existent. In fact, that was an issue of not enough workers. And there is inflation despite the price controls. But even with such high inflation, the gross national product grew 56% during the war. National debt, of course, is going to go up. How are they going to pay for the war? Bonds, taxes, and credit. And for wage earners, there's nothing to buy. What can you buy? There's no consumer goods, there's no new car or anything like that. And so a lot of money just gets tucked into savings and bank accounts, war bonds. And after the war, this savings will lead to a sustained, real, genuine economic boom as spending, consumer spending is there and it's real. There's the national debt going up. All right, and to our final of the key concepts, the mobilization of military service provided opportunities for women, minorities to improve their social economic positions for the war, but also leading to debates over racial segregation. And wartime experiences also generated challenges to civil liberties, such as the internment of Japanese Americans. And we'll start with that there. The propaganda against the Japanese was just outright racist, and they are going to be targets of the military and of the public. So Japanese Americans were loyal, and most have been born in the United States. You know, the gentleman's agreement that prevented immigration from Japan was back in Teddy Roosevelt's time. And yet the United States eyed them with suspicion and mistrust. They are saboteurs or spies, and so what do you do? Well, remove them from where they are. And where they are is on the Pacific coast, is where most live. Many of them were fishermen or had small farms. And concern, Los Angeles, San Francisco, major port cities with lots of ships coming in and out. And so move them away. And through an executive order, they were detained and moved into concentration camps, mostly in the Rocky Mountains. This was their property was seized, their fishing boats, their farms, and this was challenged and upheld by the Supreme Court. Much later, in 1988, the government did apologize and compensate the victims for this. And this happened in Canada as well. There's public attitude, and this is moving day. And they were expected to bring all their own things like clothing, cooking supplies, utensils. What they couldn't bring, and this will probably anger you more than the fact that they were detained, is that they weren't allowed to bring the family pets. And there's some there in the camp. Now, migrations. There was a tremendous amount of migrations of people during the war. Millions moved. A great economic shift will take place during the war. And many soldiers, they volunteer up. They're off in Europe or Japan or wherever. And after the war, they're not going to go home. They're going to go somewhere else. And we're going to get some boom towns in the South and the West. And FDR saw the war as an opportunity to invest in the South. And a lot of the defense dollars are going to go to places like Houston, Los Angeles, the Sun Belt, as it's called, the sunny Texas, California, Arizona. And blacks are going to continue to leave the South, look to the North and the West for opportunity there. Now, the Great Migration, we've seen this before and happening in World War I, but it really came to a trickle during the Great Depression. So now it's picking up again and much more. Everything is much more scale in World War II and afterwards. And a lot of push of them off. Their need for labor in the South is going to slow down because of the invention of a mechanical cotton picker that'll clean off the cotton and don't need the labor for that. And yeah, 5 million during the 1940s and 1970s, and majority living in northern urban centers. And so the issue of race is no longer confined to a region, as African Americans are living everywhere in the country. Now, blacks, for them, they're fighting two wars and looking for a double V victory. They want to defeat the Japanese and the Germans, but it's also about defeating racism. And growth in the NAACP soars during this time. And a new group, Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, will be leaders in the coming civil rights movement. And many Native Americans will be leaving the reservations and moving into cities during this time as well. And for all minorities, Native Americans, African Americans, homosexuals, women, and others, World War II will be the leap forward into the movements for proper status in society. Showing a number of the movements. We see the boomtowns: Los Angeles, Houston, New York, Washington, D.C. A lot of the clerical work of organizing the war in Washington, D.C. New York, of course, because of the big harbor and connection over to Europe, and L.A. is the big jumping off into the Pacific and the Pacific War. And we're fighting to end the racial prejudice, which is holding us down, is the message of this one. Now, as they move into the cities, and a lot more Mexican Americans moving into the United States through the Bracero program, there is going to be a racial backlash. And one of the most infamous is the Zoot Suit riot of Los Angeles. A Zoot suit is this fashion here, very popular among Mexican Americans. And there was a backlash as one night a number of American servicemen, particularly naval sailors, went after them and bashed in their skulls, bashed in their heads. And another incident was in Detroit against African Americans, a race riot in Detroit in 1943. So we'll end the home front with Roosevelt, who won a third term with the threat of war, and the war's still on, came in with the fourth term. And it was sort of clear that the possibility that Roosevelt might not survive his final term in office, the selection of a vice president was very key. And Harry S. Truman was chosen, and this is Harry S. Truman, who will, of course, become the president. We'll see out the final days of the war and the early Cold War. All right, that's where we end. Thank you very much for listening.